Before we get into this week's episode, we have a very special announcement to make. Kelly and I have just launched our latest Kickstarter project, Sebastian Crow's Guide to Drakenheim. We're bringing this project to life with our amazing partners at Ghostfire Gaming who have sponsored this week's episode.
This new book is going to be filled with a ton of player options for you to explore, including new subclasses for every core class, a brand new class, the Apothecary, also new tool feats, new spells, new contaminated magic, and a whole ton of lore on the world of Drakenheim.
Whether you are running our original Dungeons of Drakenheim campaign, looking for new dark fantasy-inspired player options for your home games, or just a fan of the world that we've created in our live streams and want to dive more into the lore of this world, we're so excited to share that with you in this next project. In addition to expanding the book with so many new stretch goals, we've created a host of amazing gameplay accessories to bring to your game, including some really amazing miniatures that we are super proud of.
So if you want to keep up on everything involving this Kickstarter, which is currently live and running until mid-September, make sure to check the links below to get in on it while you still can. And now, onto this week's episode.
Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for GMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Today we are continuing our series on ranking the classes in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and I'll bet this is one that all of you have been waiting for, because today we are asking the question, which class is the best damage dealer in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition?
There are many ways to deal damage in Dungeons & Dragons. We have our martial combatants who are really excellent at dealing damage, but there's also a lot of damage dealing spells and abilities and some blaster mages and all sorts of other fun ways that you can wreak havoc on your enemies. But today the question is, which class can reliably dish out the most damage time and time again?
We'd like to start off by acknowledging there's a lot of different damage dealing styles in 5e. You can deal damage at melee or range. You can have single target damage, and you can also have AoE damage. There's also distinctions to be made between sustained damage, characters that can deal a high amount of damage reliably round over round, versus characters who can do burst damage, a lot of damage that is often enough to slay an enemy in a single hit. There's a lot of nuances deciding which is better or which are worse, and there's a lot of different variable situations where one might be stronger than the other. But by and large, we're looking at the big picture here of which class can kind of capture the most of these archetypes, offers the most options, and across all of these different damage types has something to offer.
It is also worth keeping in mind that when we are ranking these classes for damage dealing, we need to look at the class overall. Specifically with damage dealing, there are a lot of subclasses for some of the classes that really steer them towards being some of the best damage dealers in the game. And when you start busting out the math, you can actually see that there are multi-class combinations that actually are stronger by taking two maybe not as high ranked classes, jamming them together, and you end up with some of the best damage dealers in the game. So although there are so many options, and I think at this point almost every class has a subclass or a build option that you can use to turn that class into a damage dealer, we want to try to look at the broad scope and decide which classes are very consistently going to be excellent damage dealers, almost no matter how you build them. And that's why up on the screen right now, you're going to see the way that we are ranking these classes. We're only going to award one S tier to whatever class we think is the best in the game, and there's almost no way you can't be a damage dealer with that class. Keep in mind, though, that an A tier is still really amazing in the role, really close to an S tier even in some cases, and there are many options, and the class presents itself as being a really good damage dealer. A B tier is a class that has several options that you need to choose, but you can definitely build a good damage dealer. A C tier might have one subclass or a certain build that you can make to really steer them in the direction of this party role. And the D tier, you're going to really struggle to get them to fit into this party role.
With that, there's a lot to discuss, so let's get rolling.
All right, so kicking things off with the Artificer, in terms of damage dealing, I think that the Artificer is this really interesting middle ground. There's a lot of cool damage dealing options here. There's infusions to help you build a damage dealer. There are spells to help you be a blaster. You can be heavily armored and go on the front lines, which allows you to continue to dish out that damage. You can have the Battlesmith with your companion that allows you to attack with both of them. Or you can have the Artillerist who has their cannon and their turret, and you can really deal a lot of damage with that build as well. So out of the Artificers, I don't necessarily think that they are the greatest damage dealer in the game. I do think that there are decent options here, and I think that they're a B ranking.
I agree with that assessment. I think the Artificer, once again, demonstrates a class that has a lot of potential, has a lot of options that you can choose from, but you do really have to pick those options. I think that in that respect, the Artificer is the definition of the class in a box, right? The damage dealer in a box. If you want to put together all the pieces that the Artificer offers you, for example, by being a Battlesmith or a Armorer Artificer who picks up the right weapon proficiencies, picks up the right feats, picks up the right spells, chooses the right mix of infusions, you can end up with a very, very effective damage dealer that could be the beatdown for your party, depending on the way the rest of the party is set up. I will say that oftentimes to have success as a damage dealer, as an Artificer, it is contingent on you choosing the right infusions, the right spells, having those feats, and even being the right subclass. I don't know what you're going to do to be a damage dealer if you're going to play an Alchemist Artificer. On the other hand, the Battlesmith and the Armorer offer a lot of options, and the Artillerist, I think, has good options, but I've found myself surprised at how the Artillerist often doesn't have the same oomph that the other Artificer options do, despite being presented as the damage dealer. I think that there's a couple counterintuitive things there that with the Artillerist in particular, I think that they're one subclass that is hurt by the fact that that they're trying to be a spell-based damage dealer, but the Artificer has that slow spell progression. When the Artillerist Artificer is getting Fireball, that's not until 9th level, when other spellcasters have had that spell for several levels now. And I find the intervening period with the Arcane Firearm, while it's impressive, it doesn't really let you interact with the other traditional damage dealing strategies that we might see in D&D 5e.
So let's talk about the Barbarian. I think that this is one class that we all know is advertised as a damage dealer.
Yes.
It's really impossible, in my opinion, to play a Barbarian that isn't going to be a primary damage dealer. We've talked a lot about the Barbarian, and they've gotten a lot of D rankings in
the series, but this is one place where they're not going to get that.
Yeah, this is the one place where they shine. They are a good tank, and they're a good damage dealer. The Barbarian is well suited, and we're going to see this with several of the martial classes, but they're well suited to take the damage dealing feats, like if you take Great Weapon Master or Polearm Master, and you can really run into battle raging, and no matter what subclass you play, all of the subclasses have something that lend themselves towards you being even better at dealing damage. So for that reason, they were in consideration for the S tier. They did not make the S tier for me, though. They do get a very high A in this category.
You nailed it. The Barbarian is obviously a damage dealer in all of their class features. You have the encouragement to use strength-based two-handed weapons. You get Reckless Attack, giving you advantage on basically every attack that you want to have advantage on. You have Rage that is adding to your damage and your survivability at the same time. And it is very obvious to even a casual reader of the player's handbook that Great Weapon Master would probably be a good idea for a Barbarian. It's amazing how you can introduce D&D 5e to a new player, and they can be like, I want to play Barbarian. I want to take Great Weapon Master. And anybody can see that combination. Like, it's not even like a secret, right? Like, it's just obvious. And so new players love it because A plus B equals I'm having a good time. And I think we'll see this as a recurring theme throughout the rest of this episode is oftentimes the classes that rank highly are the classes that play really, really well with the Great Weapon Master and its cousin. And the Barbarian is one of them. It just is a very natural fit. The Barbarian remains strong throughout their entire career, and depending on your choice of subclass, you can amp their damage up into the stratosphere. And certainly if you go further with the way that you build your Barbarian and also take Polearm Master, that's kind of the less intuitive choice, I think, for a lot of people. They imagine their Barbarian is wielding a great axe and they want to have that fantasy. So they don't think, oh, I'm going to pick up a pole axe and go further with it. That's fine. There's a lot of other great feats that you can choose the Barbarian to amp up your damage and to create the feeling of your character. And so you're still going to end up with this character that is satisfying to play and is a presence on the battlefield.
Just to jump off of what you said, I have a brand new player, first time playing D&D, at my table right now. Handed them the player's handbook and said, you can read through this, pick what you want to play. They came to the table with a dwarf barbarian, totem barbarian, taking the bear, and Great Weapon Master and a giant sword. And that's their shtick. And I'm like, yep, you did it. You're playing D&D.
Yeah, and that is so accessible for new players. It is really easy for them to remember their abilities. It's probably one of the better beginner character builds in the out there, at least for players that are coming from a background of maybe video games as well and like seeing the big numbers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As we move on to the Bard, we're doing a little bit of a reversal. It's interesting that with a lot of our categories, we have been very much praising the spellcasters. The Bard has gotten a lot of S tiers. Great negotiator, great infiltrator, great... So many of those aspects of play. Bard, amazing. When we come to damage dealing, this is where I think we finally get to say, Bard, this isn't your playground. And I will say there are options. You can play a Valor Bard or a Swords Bard, and you can be a decent damage dealer. But I think even when the Bard is performing at their best for dealing damage, they don't come into the same realm as the Barbarian, even. So when I'm looking at the Bard, yeah, you can take some blasty spells. You can play a Swords Bard or a Valor Bard, and there are specific ways you could be a damage-dealing Bard. I don't really think they're steered in that direction. Most of their spell list is not going to be very blasty. And I think they're a D, not like a D like... Ooh. Yeah, I felt like this is the one time that I'm giving the Bard a D, and it's not a D like you suck and there's no options for you. It's a D like if you really want to play the damage dealer, you got to work for it.
I agree that the Bard has to work for it. I don't know if I would go as far as giving the Bard a D tier ranking for damage dealing, because I do think that there are options there. I just think it's going to be a bit of a struggle to get to that point, because at the early levels of play, before your subclass comes online, and certainly for the higher level Bard builds, before you get that 10th level magical secrets, it's a real uphill road. That is an uphill road that you can fix very easily through multiclassing. And I am very impressed by what I see from, for example, Hexblade Bards, or even Bards that take a couple levels of Fighter, or otherwise. But that is dipping into the toes of multiclassing. That is dipping into the toes of building your character in a specific way. And often for the Bards that are dependent on magical secrets, you either can be the lore Bard that gets magical secrets early but then doesn't get extra attack, or you can be the upper level Bard that waits for a really long time. So for quite a while, there was a very popular combination for a Valor Bard that was to take Sharpshooter and Crossbow Expert and get extra attack, and then even get something like, or maybe not take Crossbow Expert, because you would take Swift Quiver with your 10th level magical secrets. And so now you were shooting 4 times per turn. And that is a pretty decent damage dealer, albeit one that takes until 10th level to actually get their shtick happening, and who is passable in that intervening period, but not necessarily excelling compared to what you would get out the gate. So you definitely feel like a character that can contribute in the damage area, and then is bringing all the other utility that the Bard has at the same time as that, but it doesn't really feel like you're totally succeeding in all fields. I think you can build some good damage dealing Bards. I think it really opens up when you multi-class, and so for me, I would give the Bard a C. Because that ranking is not because there's bad options. It's because you have to plan the build very carefully. You have to know what you're doing from the outset. There are going to be several levels across that character build that are going to feel bad.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to grin and bear through it and wait for several levels for the whole thing to come online. And then it might be pretty good.
That's fair. And I think my memory of a damage dealing bard, or not so much, is Joe playing a bard at our table. And he had a rapier, and every time he used it, he would be like, that's 3 damage. And we were like level 8 or 9. And every time he kept doing it, and then he'd be like, why am I using my sword?
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, as a bard, yeah, it's like, why aren't you just using Vicious Mockery? Why aren't you just using any other spell? Why aren't you just using anything else? Oftentimes, things that don't deal damage. And if you look at the bard's native spell list, there's not really a lot of damage dealing options on there. Most of the damage dealing options come with some form of utility or battlefield control attached to them. Even things like Synaptic Static, or even things like Thunderwave, or even things like Dissonant Whispers. Now, it's interesting, if you want to make the argument that the bard, in fulfilling their support role, brings a lot of extra damage to the table, sure. But we're thinking about role. But that's the support role. We're thinking about the direct damage dealing capability here, and it is hard to find it.
As we come to the Cleric, I think the Cleric is an interesting middle ground as well, because the Cleric, for most people, when they think of a Cleric, they think of healing, support, maybe a bit of utility, some battlefield control. They don't really think of damage dealing, but on the flip side of that, they're underselling the potential of damage dealing on the Cleric. Cleric has Spirit Guardian, Spiritual Weapon, Guiding Bolt, Toll the Dead, Sacred Flame. Like, they have some really, really powerful damage dealing spells, and they can actually dish out some of the most damage on the battlefield. However, with their versatility of spellcasting, and with a Cleric in the party often being relied on for the support, the healing, which is support, but I'm going to just say support or healing, utility, with them being kind of sectioned into that, they don't always gravitate immediately towards being the damage dealer. And so I think we are in the realm of the exact B tier. Lots of options. Are you going to take them? If you do, you're good.
I think the Cleric inherently has the most efficient damage-dealing spellcasting combo out there, in the form of Spirit Guardians plus Spiritual Weapon and Toll the Dead. This is a very efficient damage-dealing combination, because for the cost of a 2nd level spell slot and a 3rd level spell slot, then defaulting to cantrips, you have this very reliable round-over-round damage that you can take through an entire combat encounter, because you concentrate on Spirit Guardians, you don't have to concentrate on Spiritual Weapon, you just use your bonus action to continue swinging with it, and then you've got Toll the Dead giving you all that additional damage. We have sung the praises of this combination many times, but it does have its limitations, and one of those big limitations is when you run up against magic resistance and monsters with very high wisdom saving throws. And oftentimes that is where you see the damage just tank on this. It's still reliable, and in fact, it's far less susceptible to, say, a character who casts Scorching Ray and Fireball, and that was all the damage that they got out in that combat. But you still see it drop off very precipitously. Oftentimes, the best damage-dealing strategy in D&D 5e is to be able to have attack rolls as the basis, because it's, generally speaking, monsters don't get their AC as high as what their saving throws get to be, and you don't run up against things like legendary resistance and magic resistance when you're dealing with attack rolls. Any Cleric is just a day's worth of spells preparation away from being a really good damage dealer. But even if you prepare those spells as a Cleric, you're going to be negotiating, okay, is this the combat where I'm the damage dealer, or is this the combat where I'm fulfilling the support role? Because if you are concentrating on a damage dealing spell, it's hard for you to bring down your other support type spells if you're using your spell slots on your damage dealing. Again, it's hard to. So I think the Cleric ends up with a lot of compromises. And finally, there's not a lot of builds for Clerics to bring their damage up a lot higher either.
Yeah, really we are just talking about the fact that they have some great spells, but a lot of the abilities from the subclasses are really more about that support role. And honestly, there are some times where your party is going to gain more in a combat encounter from you concentrating on Bless than they did from you concentrating on Spirit Guardians.
Yeah. You can get some very impressive results out of Tempest Domain Clerics abusing the fact that they can get max damage on a thunder damage dealing spell or a lightning damage dealing spell, And Death Domain Clerics also have some really interesting options for dealing a whole bunch of damage as well. But again, there are limitations to those things. Those things very much gravitate those characters towards being able to do one massive hit, not so much that consistent damage.
As we come to the Druid, often the Druid and the Cleric are kind of two sides of the same coin to me, but one's nature and one's holy. Interestingly enough, with the Druid, I actually think that we get less options than the Cleric. Mm-hmm. There are, though, some prominent options here that I actually think we do need to talk about, because although the Druid itself feels much more like a support character, your wild shape is kind of utility focused. A lot of it is support and utility, and healing and problem solving and exploration. But if you play, there's actually quite a few subclasses that really lean into some damage. If you're playing a Circle of the Moon, you can be a decent damage dealer by combining a good wild shape with Moonbeam, and suddenly you're a bear eating people inside of a Moonbeam.
Yep.
But also, if we talk about the Shepherd Druid and their ability to summon a bazillion animals onto the battlefield, and suddenly a million elk are trampling over your enemies, that is something that we've talked about being pretty messy on the table. It can be really clunky to have that many animals, but if we're not worried about the clunkiness and we're just talking about damage dealing, there are options there for the Druid.
And we saw that in our one-shot play with Chris from Tramlex Temple, where he did play a Shepherd Druid that did a lot of damage by summoning hordes of velociraptors and giant owls. So if you have that kind of system mastery to know, oh, these are the cool monsters to summon. Druids also have cool spells like Erupting Earth. They have Wall of Fire. You mentioned Moonbeam. Druids also do have a lot of ways to instigate their battlefield control to push and pull enemies into those damaging areas and using those elements around. I also think the Circle of the Stars Druid is pretty cool with what they do with Guiding Bolt and with their various constellations to deal damage. But at the end of the day, it's an uphill battle. It does. It relies on either a favorable ruling of Conjure Animals and a favorable interpretation on the part of the Dungeon Master to give you that. Like, I guess if your DM is going to let you summon your horde of Velociraptors, maybe the Druid is S tier. But if your Dungeon Master is not going to let that fly, and if you're not going to, or your table's just not going to use that as your go-to strategy, I think the Druid is C at best.
I mean, I also want to throw a nod in here to the Wildfire Druid, the Circle of Spores Druid, but even with all of these, like, there are many options for a Druid to have a few great damage-dealing tricks up their sleeve. Mm-hmm. But I don't think the Druid is ever the blaster.
No.
And even with the subclasses that say, hey, you get a bit of blasting, they're still not the primary blaster. So I'm willing to agree. I don't think that they're as strong of an option as the Cleric is in damage dealing. So I'm going to give them a C, which, again, you can build a damage dealing Druid.
It's just uphill.
It's just uphill.
Yep. The Fighter. Here we go. Because I think the Fighter is such a versatile framework for building a damage dealer. There are so many tantalizing options here, from Action Surge being probably one of the most amazing burst damage powers in the game, to the fact that they are the only class that gets upwards of 4 attacks natively through getting additional attacks on top of extra attack as you get into higher levels, to just having a plethora of build options and the more opportunities to take feats. So as a fighter, you can get Great Weapon Master, Polearm Master online before anybody else. You want to have Sharpshooter, Crossbow Expert online, you got it before any other class can get it, basically. Unless you're playing variant humans and custom lineages aside. And it only gets better once you start adding subclasses on top of it. There are so many fighter subclasses that have been the cornerstone of powerful damage-dealing builds. How many times have you talked to someone that is putting together a character build that being like, I was really tempted to take 2 levels of fighter so I could get Action Surge?
I mean, I'm just going to agree with everything you said, and really anything I'm going to say is probably going to echo that. But The idea of a fighter just having more feats, having more attacks, and really, like, even when I look at something like the champion is one of my least favorite fighter subclasses, I would still play a champion and know that I'm going to deal some of the best damage in the entire game. All the subclasses, except maybe the Purple Dragon Knight, are going to be amazing. And, like, there's not a bad option here that, like, takes away from the fighter's ability to consistently deal damage. And one thing that I do want to point out when we look at some of our other damage-dealing classes, the one that was contending for S tier, that we're going to get to later, does not do something that the fighter does. And that is the fighter's ability to make multiple attacks. And with Action Surge, high-level fighter, Action Surge, let's make 8 attacks. And so what you get with that is, some other classes can Nova a single enemy and be like, I'm going to drop 200 damage on this enemy. And then you go, okay, that enemy's dead. But if you're killing minions and you Nova 200 damage on a minion, that's a waste. But a fighter can kill 8 minions with an Action Surge at high levels if they can hit each time.
One of the things that I see fighters do more consistently than all the other damage dealing classes, and this is admittedly a thing that happens to them at higher levels, is the fighter often is the one class that, thanks to Action Surge, is able to take out 2 or 3 really tough foes in a single turn. So oftentimes the Barbarian can totally... I've seen Barbarians one-round dragons. I have seen Paladins one-round dragons, or particularly demons or undead or liches. But we've seen a fighter take out 2 dragons in one turn at our table in one of our recent game sessions. The fighter often, by merit of their additional attacks, by merit of Action Surge, by merit of just their build mechanics, is often able to just jump right in there and slice and dice, and nothing is left. For me, this is the factor that takes the fighter into the S tier, for me, personally. You don't have to build a melee fighter. You can build a ranged fighter, and it's just as good, if not better. And the fact that it's amazing, no matter which way you go with it, is a really big feather in the cap for supporting the fighter's options. And then if you want to layer Battlemaster or Eldritch Knight or whatever other subclass you want to take upon it, you have this amazing chassis that you can take in whatever direction you want to go.
So I'm agreeing that the fighters are S tier. I don't think there's really an argument there. They're not only consistent with very high damage capabilities, but their ability to use feats, all of the subclasses, and their extreme versatility on play styles. Sword and board, polearm, ranged. You can do whatever you want and still be one of the best damage dealers. All right, so let's talk about the monk. Now, this is something that, in theory, the monk should be great at. But
In theory.
The monks, I'm going to give them a little bit of praise here. They do get quite a few attacks. Same as the fighter, they are able to divvy them up and move around. They have extreme maneuverability, which allows them to mix and match how they're going to attack. Now, the monk also is kind of this weird mix of not as good of a damage dealer as the primary damage dealers, but they mix damage dealing with utility, with Stunning Strike. But we're not talking about utility. So if we're just looking at pure damage dealing, there are some subclasses that do make them better at damage dealing, but they are never amazing. The Mercy Monk has offered some redemption to deal more damage. The Drunken Master Monk has the ability to do like massive flurries of attacks to a bunch of enemies around them. There are some really fun ways that you can build a monk. I think even the Kensai Monk has some cool damage dealing potential. And for those reasons, I don't think they ever get higher. Even when you're at your best build, you're probably at about an A- or a B+, but I want to give them a B for damage dealing because they can do it.
I give the Bard a C. And I feel like the Bard has more options for being a better damage dealer than the monk does.
Really?
Yeah, I just think that there's not a lot of room to go with a monk. Like, you have to hope that your subclass is going to give you something, because in the base class on its own, there's very little that you can actually do with what the base class of the monk to increase your damage. There's barely any feats that support the monk's signature fighting style of being an unarmed combatant, because I guess Wizards of the Coast didn't feel that it was necessary to have like an unarmed combat feat, because only the monks would take it. And so in the process, monks kind of suffer because there's no feat or feat support in D&D 5e that really improves one-handed weapon damage or dual wielding damage. If there was a completely neutral power attack feat, which personally I think there should be, like if there was a feat that just said power attack -5 +10, doesn't matter what kind of damage, what kind of weapon you're wielding, you can just do a -5 +10, then yeah, the monks would be amazing because of flurry of blows and what that would do in terms of combination. So the monk is like this class that is waiting for one thing to kick them over the edge. And I think for me it's a C, and I'm giving them a C against my better judgment to not give them a D. But I think it's really pretty poor, right? Like a monk is going to come into the game with a decent capability for dealing okay damage. Like their baseline is not too bad. But the moment you start layering any sort of build options, it's like the monk just doesn't have any build options. And that's why I can't even give them a B, because I feel like beyond choosing your subclass and beyond like the base class just kind of sets you up and say, yep, choose your weapon, choose your subclass, that's all you've got. And even when you choose the subclass, you don't end up with anything that is remotely comparable to the other primary damage dealers. I think it's a real tough place for the poor monk.
I mean, I personally feel like there's more build options than you might be considering, but that's also from me who loves monks. And
yeah.
We know that I like monks and you're not the biggest fan of them, and that's okay. You see all the holes, I see all the potential, and that's why we're doing these videos.
I mean, ultimately, I like the fantasy of the monk. I think that the idea of playing a monk, an unarmed combatant that has like these kind of quasi-magical abilities is really cool. And I'm critical of it because I feel the class needs to be fundamentally re-examined.
All right, so we're coming to the Paladin. Now, when we talked about the fighter, I did mention that the one benefit that the fighter has is the ability to make multiple attacks, which means that they'll never waste a Nova attack. When we come to the Paladin, I will say right now that it was my other consideration for S tier,
Yeah.
but the one thing that they have to do is they basically are big Nova machines.
Yes, the Paladin, I think, is the poster child for burst damage in D&D 5e. We have all seen the dramatic critical hit Divine Smite obliterate powerful demons and undead, and it is satisfying, it is fun. I gotta say, it might be that fighter is the better damage dealer. I think the Barbarian and the Paladin might be more fun. Just in my survey for new players overall, but I think that they're all satisfying in many different ways. But I think that there is something about that big damage moment, which is so satisfying. And you get that in spades with the Paladin.
We were doing a campaign that was very Dark Souls, where we had full reign of walking around a city. Sounds familiar. And we could walk into the wrong place and run into the wrong monster. And I remember we once, at a low level, ran into a giant demon. And you were like, well, this is a total party kill. And then the bard cast haste on my Paladin.
Yep.
And I ran in, and I think I landed a critical 3rd or 4th level smite. And I did so much damage in that turn that I killed the demon. And you were like, I thought this was thought you were going to mop the floor with that demon, but my Paladin killed it in one turn. And that's what a Paladin does.
And I think you see that in particular because so many Paladin players, yourself included, have a tendency to just go ham. Like, they use all their spell slots smiting in the first round of combat. They drop everything, and then they run out of gas really, really quickly.
Yes.
And I think that that's the biggest thing that holds back the Paladin, is that when you start smiting on every single attack, and why wouldn't you? You can still build your Paladin around having Great Weapon Master and Polearm Master, but because the Paladin is a little bit more feat-starved, and because the Paladin wants to have... Paladins care about their charisma score, and they have other roles that they're really good at performing, which maybe the fighter might not care about. Like, as a Paladin, you might care about your capability to provide support. And while both the fighter and the paladin are both capable of being damage dealers and frontliners at the same time, because the paladin has this third focus that is often being like, yeah, you could be an amazing damage dealer, but do you want to take sentinel or do you want to take inspiring leader here? And oftentimes the support elements of your paladin are often asking you, you got this really nice support feature that you could be bringing if you're willing to compromise a little bit on your ability to be a damage dealer. And that's a constant temptation, I think, for any paladin, is that you want to do right, you want to be that team player, right? Yeah.
And I think that when we do come to ranking the paladin, like I played a vengeance paladin who had great weapon master, was a half orc. It was intense. That paladin was the damage dealer. But they were also backed up by, I believe, like a bard and a wizard who were constantly buffing them. So it was just insane what my paladin could do. But not all paladins are doing that. And paladins are a very split class in the sense that they're one of the only classes that demands that you look at more than 2 stats to be good. You want a good constitution, you want a good strength, you want a good charisma. Those 3, as opposed to most classes, there's 2 and then maybe a third that maybe you could dabble in.
But as a paladin, you really want to have a high strength, a high charisma, and you need to have a good con. And so when it comes to the big flagship damage dealers, they're one of the only damage dealers that does suffer from that issue. They have amazing subclasses. They have an amazing spell list. Everything is great. You can build an absolute monster of a damage dealing paladin. I do think it requires a little bit more care and consideration than the fighter, because as a fighter, your basic only determination is who are you going to attack and when are you going to spend action surge. And as a paladin, you always want to smite. You want to smite all the time. You just want to smite, and then you run out of those spell slots, and you're like,
It's tough having a spell list as a paladin, because you're like, when do I use these? And I do think after all of this, I feel like we're talking down about the paladin, which we're not, because I'm giving it an A.
Well, we're giving it an A, and it's an A+. I think that all of these things that we're discussing are kind of why it didn't get the S tier ranking. And I do have to say that maybe if I'd had something different for breakfast today and had an extra cup of coffee, I might have given the S tier ranking to the paladin. It's that close. Yeah. But we're choosing only one. If we didn't have to choose one, I think for me it would be the paladin and the fighter as the S tier. I think that the 2 of them are just a cut above the barbarian overall. It's so narrow though. It's so narrow.
Yeah, but really, like the paladin, when we give it an A and it doesn't get the S tier here, you need to keep in mind that I assume we're going to do a video at some point that's all of our rankings, and you're going to see that the paladin is B, A, or S in a lot of categories.
Yeah.
And that makes them one of the best classes in the game.
And even some people have argued with us about where we gave them D tier rankings, and they got good reasons for doing so.
Yeah. So Paladin might be one of the strongest classes in the whole game. It's just other classes have lower lows and might push out the Paladin in terms of what they're really, really good at.
Moving on to the Ranger. The Ranger is much maligned. Almost as maligned as the Monk. But the contrast between the Ranger and the Monk in the actual damage-dealing department is they're in a completely different league. Because, well, the Monk doesn't have any of the build options to be an amazing damage dealer. The Ranger actually has a plethora of them. Because not only does the Ranger have the ability to get the archery fighting style, 2-weapon fighting style, they can get sharpshooter, hunter's mark, lots of additional features, a great spell list. Rangers can cast conjure animals. They can cast conjure woodland beings. And Rangers also got the Gloomstalker.
Yeah, the Gloomstalker is the all-star, but even if we look at some of the other subclasses that have been introduced ever since they came out with the Gloomstalker, from that point onwards, we have seen a massive rise in what the Ranger is capable of. Yeah. And some of the most fun subclasses that I have seen, and actually more than ever, I went from the Ranger being like, not my favorite class in the game, to I really want to play a Ranger.
Yeah.
And so they have a lot of what the fighter has for their ability to build a character who is reliable in melee combat.
I just have to say, like, I think about our experience recently with Drakenheim, where we have Jill piloting a fighter that took Great Weapon Master, but then her other character is a Gloomstalker Ranger who has Sharpshooter. And you see, when you have someone that is really good at fighting and has that good combat strategy and that good awareness, regardless of those two, putting it on the table, I actually feel like Veo often outperforms Rudy. Although Rudy now it's a tough call. The thing is with the Gloomstalker Ranger is that the ranged, in my opinion, ranged damage dealing is almost always stronger than melee, even if it doesn't do as much damage. It's the sniper effect of ranged damage that is so effective. Like, as a dungeon master, if you put a fighter in front of me with Great Weapon Master and Polearm Master, and that same fighter with Sharpshooter and Crossbow Expert, the one that's going to warp my encounter balance more is probably going to be the Sharpshooter, for the sole reason that a character with Sharpshooter and Crossbow Expert who is an effective archer has the capability to send that damage downtown. And so if I put a Necromancer surrounded by all their minions, they get sniped.
Yeah.
And so you have to do more. You can't do the body blocking as a DM that you can with a melee damage dealer. With a melee damage dealer, I can put some zombie giants in front of the Necromancer and know that at least the Barbarian or the Paladin has to get through those. And that's a notable thing, is that the Paladin often has the teleportation spells in there. So they often have the way of like jumping, the mobility that is unexpected. Whereas the Ranger's just going to be like, yeah, I see that you have those giants, but I ignore cover. So die, Necromancer.
I think the Ranger is another A tier.
Yeah.
I don't think that they're as A tier as the Paladin or the Barbarian, but for me, they're the next choice.
Yeah.
And I think that people are undervaluing the potential that the Ranger has to be an excellent damage dealer, because, yeah, they steal bits from the fighter and they steal bits from the Druid, which are actually the Druid bits that can be used to make a damage dealer. They have a lot of cool abilities now, and you can play many Rangers that have animal companions that just add more damage.
Yeah.
And there's some really fun options now for maneuverability, damage dealing, being on the battlefield in a very meaningful way. And I think that the Ranger is a solid A.
Yeah, and it's not just the Gloomstalker anymore. I think that the revised Beastmaster, I think that the Drake Warden, I think that even if you want to go back to the classics of being the Hunter Ranger, you can make a compelling, excellent damage dealer with the pieces that you get from those classes and subclasses. However, the consistent theme across it is, did you take Sharpshooter?
I think that as we come to the Rogue, I think that this is really interesting because we have another Nova class.
Yes.
This class, baked into its system, is the Damage Nova, which is sneak attack. Rogues are often steered towards probably being a ranged combatant. You can play them melee as well, no matter what. You're fishing for the sneak attacks. You're stealthy, you're sneaky, you hit your target, you do a ton of damage.
How much did you do with your critical hit last night?
I did 80-something damage with my critical hit.
Your critical sneak attack?
Yeah, so a critical sneak attack landing...
As a 10th, 11th level rogue?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So really, really solid. And I do think that the rogue needs to be raised up here and talked about for its potential as a damage dealer. But I will say there's one big negative that all of the other damage dealers we've talked about get that the rogue doesn't get. Extra attack.
But that's where two-weapon fighting or crossbow expert really saved the day for the rogue.
Yes.
Right? So a rogue that does dual wield and a rogue that does bring in a crossbow expert can really compensate a lot for that. We've had rogues that have taken crossbow expert and sharpshooter and just been delivery vehicles for a big sneak attack. It is worth noting that Jill's Gloomstalker is multi-classed Ranger Rogue, and I think you really see the best of both worlds happening there. It's a really sweet combination. And I think that the Rogue overall, it's amazing how the baseline sneak attack looks amazing on paper, but in play can come up a little bit short. But then as soon as you are like, oh, actually sneak attack needs a little bit of help. For example, if you play an Arcane Trickster that picks up Booming Blade, or as soon as you play a Swashbuckler and have more reliable options for dealing with your sneak attacks, or even just a little bit of an augmentation, it really ups the rogue's game to a pretty impressive degree.
Yeah, and for that reason, I think I'm going to give the rogue an A as well. Again, I'm giving them that A that's more an A minus. I don't think that they can do as much as a fighter, a barbarian, or a paladin, but their ability to Nova damage, I've seen a lot of rogues one-shot a boss.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little torn here between B and A, and which is what you acknowledge for the A minus. I think that the rogue's baseline is great. But I think that it does take some building to boost the baseline. So for me, I feel like a B is where I'm at. Because I have seen some rogues that have felt like they hit like wet noodles. Because they didn't do much to build their damage up. But it's still good. It's just that as soon as you take a couple more options, it becomes so much better. The ceiling is a lot lower, though, at the end of the day. Right? Like, I think that even if you build your rogue to the 9s, I don't think the rogue's going to come anywhere close to what the barbarian, the fighter, the paladin, and even the ranger can accomplish.
Well, let's be real here. The turns that I was unable to get sneak attack, which can happen,
Yeah, it's sad.
you suddenly are not doing any... Like, you're doing some damage, but it's laughable damage.
But the merit to that, and it's once again one of the cool merits with the rogue that is kind of exclusive to them and the barbarian, is the rogue is never going to run out of gas.
Yeah.
The barbarian is never going to run out of gas. The fighter, once they spend action surge, is still really good. The paladin, once they expend all their smites, they got nothing left out in the tank. And this is one of those things that, especially as we come into the spellcasters, I think with damage dealing, it really can be that thing of, are you starting to run out of spells? Are you starting to run out of key points? Are you starting to run out of your limited use abilities? Because with damage dealers, you really want to have that consistency somewhere. Because if your Nova didn't take them out, or there was a second wave of the fight, you need something more to dig deep.
And I think that as we come to the Sorcerer, we're looking at that. Sorcerers, other than the two newest ones, don't get the expanded spell list. They have limited spell options. They do have some great meta magics. So I will say that a sorcerer who has empowered spell can be a really decent blaster. But you're limited by your spell slots.
Or a divine soul that picks up the best of the cleric spell list.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the sorcerer does have some really amazing options and it is a really compelling blaster and really great at it. But at the end of the day, this is one of the categories when we talk about damage dealing. You've heard a lot of bias from us towards spellcasters. And this is one of the categories where I'm like, I don't think the spellcasters take the cake here.
No, I mean, the spellcasters have a lot of strategies. And with spellcasters, you have to be efficient with the way that you use your spells. Because at the end of the day, a sorcerer that just decides, I'm going to fireball things over and over and over and over again, is going to do good damage. It's going to do really impressive AoE damage. But the reality is that you have three third level spell slots until you start upcasting, and you can start burning through those with Fireball in particular very, very quickly. Fireball is a great spell to kick things off at the start of combat to wash out the low damage minions, but like Fireball really starts to look ineffective when you start throwing it at a single target.
Yeah.
And in many cases, the average damage of a fireball is around 25 damage for a third level spell slot. And even in our game last night, Pluto, Veo, and even Wilhelm, their typical attack was doing more damage to a single target than a fireball would to a single target. And that's the biggest difference between AoE damage and single target damage, I think, in 5e, which is where, I love Fireball. But the martial damage dealers do more damage with a single hit than a fireball does in absolute terms. Of course, a fireball that hits 3 enemies has just done 90 damage to all of the total split across 3 foes. But oftentimes you want to take somebody out completely.
Yeah, so I think the sorcerer for me is a B. Lots of options here, and they're going to be amazing, and you can definitely be a damage dealer sorcerer and be great at it. So I think that their ceiling is really high, but you can also build a sorcerer in a completely different way, and you really have to be careful with your spell slots. And when it comes to damage dealing, sometimes dropping the concentration spell that changes the battlefield for something like support, utility, battlefield control is more impactful on the game than dropping a fireball. And when you're in a party with the primary damage dealers and you drop slow on your enemies or hypnotic pattern or something like that, that is usually a better move for a lot of these spellcasters. So I think the sorcerer is a B because there's a lot of good ways to play them. The blaster is one of them, but the blaster is not as good as a fighter with action surge.
I mean, and that's the sad thing, is that over the course of a combat encounter, you can get a lot of damage out of a concentration spell when it's well used. And as we move on to the Warlock really relies on this, because here you go. Warlock, spell slots coming back on a short rest. We got Hex. We got Eldritch Blast. We got Agonizing Blast. We got Forceful Blast. We can Forceful Blast people into our Hunger of Hadar or our Wall of Fire or our Damaging Area effect. And so with the Warlock, we actually have a spellcaster that can bring that round over round consistent damage, and that is really geared towards it basically out of necessity. Because with the Warlock, you're going to burn your spell slots immediately, so one of them better be a concentration spell to help your damage out.
And I think when we do come to the Warlock, it's actually interesting that we are more limited in our spell slots. But we talk about how spellcasters, they have their limited spell slots, and they're very versatile in their build options. But I think for me, Warlock squeaks into the A tier.
Okay.
And the reason why I want to say that is, yeah, you can build a Warlock any way you choose, but you're going to notice something that happens at the table. If a sorcerer says, I'm going to build a battlefield control sorcerer, everybody goes, oh, cool, that's good. But if you're a Warlock and you say, I'm going to build a Warlock that isn't taking Eldritch Blast and Hex, everybody at the table turns and looks at you like you've just done something completely off book. And so with the Warlock, I find that everybody who reads the Warlock goes, Eldritch Blast, Hex, Agonizing Blast, maybe another thing that allows me to either push or pull targets using my Eldritch Blast. And then Eldritch Blast is the most powerful blasting cantrip in the game. You get multiple beams, so now we're looking at the same way the fighter can divvy up attacks. They can blast, that guy's dead, move over, blast. And there are subclasses that amplify this even further. They can drop like a cool spell like Hunger of Hadar and then blast everybody to bits. I think that they squeak into the A because out of all the spellcasters, not playing the Blaster Warlock is something that people go, oh, that's a weird choice. And I feel like you almost have to...
You could be a Hexblade.
Okay, in which case you're still an amazing damage dealer.
Yes, you often very much are. But I will say for my part, I think that top tier Eldritch Blast damage dealer is a little bit tricky to do. I think that a lot of players see Eldritch Blast, Agonizing Blast, and Hex and don't think about it more than that. And there are many more options out there. And I do think that the build really matters for the Warlock. It really does, and you have to figure out when you're going to take your invocations, what spells you're going to use, what you're going to do in what order. And if you nail all of those things, you will end up with a phenomenal damage dealer. But for me, that's the definition of a B tier.
Fair.
Yeah.
As we move on to the Wizard, I think that we come to all the same things we said about a lot of the spellcasters
Evoker, S tier.
You think the Evoker's the S tier?
No.
Okay. I was going to be like, the Evoker isn't even the best blaster in the game.
No, the Evoker isn't even the best blaster in the game. The best damage dealer I think that you can build with a Wizard is a Blade Singer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's amazing. Perhaps one of the best damage dealers in the game. But that is but one build. And one build does not an entire class ranking get you.
Again, even less so than the Sorcerer, I don't think that the Wizard is pushed into being a damage dealer.
Yeah.
I think that there are great spells for dealing damage, and you can drop all the fireballs you want, lightning bolts and meteor swarms at higher levels, and you can wreck the battlefield. But I think that, like a lot of the spellcasters we're talking about, a Wizard gets more out of not being the damage dealer.
Yes.
They're a battlefield controller. They get things like Force Cage and Mirror Image and Simulacrum, and like they get spells that nobody else gets. that they can use to change the world. And when they focus on being a damage dealer, I think they fall under our other damage dealers, and you're missing out on what the wizard's potential is.
I mean, at the end of the day, the wizard, if they do want to throw down, can summon a big beast hand, animate a bunch of objects, summon up some fae, or throw people into a prismatic wall.
Yeah.
So it's not that a wizard can't do damage.
No, they can't.
But oftentimes, as a wizard, I think that you really want to have this holistic view. And it's interesting, again, the wizard has an ironic dearth of actual build options for improving their damage. There's not a lot of feats that you can take to increase your damage. There's spell selection, and you can choose different combinations of spells with the wizard. And you can also do some interesting multi-classing. And I think it's worth mentioning that there's some really cool multi-classing that you can do by adding Sorcerer to get Meta Magic to either the Warlock or the Wizard, or even taking Meta Magic Adept or taking Eldritch Adept, or mixing and matching some interesting things around. But again, those are all builds. And we're not ranking based on builds alone. We're ranking on the big picture. And I think the big picture for the Wizard is that it's a B. For me, it's not that the Wizard can't do good damage. It's that oftentimes the wizard can answer their problems in ways that don't require them to do damage at all. And if you try to answer every problem, as much as say, Fireball is not always the answer to every problem.
It's the answer to a lot of them.
It's the answer to a lot of them, but it's not always the answer to every single problem. And that's, for me, is where they land as a B.
I'm willing to agree. I think that the wizard, to me, has always felt more like a support utility role than it has a damage dealer. But the wizard has the benefit of being able to fill almost any role in a party that you need it to fill based on your build options. We gave it S tier in something like utility because they have access to some of the best utility spells in the game and can easily be the best. Whereas when they focus on being a damage dealer, I think they can stand up with the other damage dealers. You could have a party that's a paladin, a fighter, a barbarian, a ranger, and a wizard who's focusing on damage dealing, and you're going to wreck everything. But I actually think in that party, you'd be better off with a utility wizard.
Maybe.
So I'm going to give it a B tier.
Let's see what the community thought. So, this is pretty cut and dry.
Yes, I think that we are all in agreement that the fighter is the top tier damage dealer. But unlike some of our other party roles, this is a little more mixed. The fighter wins, clearly.
Yes.
And got the most votes from our whole community. But there were a lot of other people who thought that there were other classes that were the best in the game. Paladin gets a huge chunk here, and that's worth noting that it comes in second, followed not too far behind by the Barbarian, and then, interestingly enough, the Rogue, the Sorcerer, and the Wizard beat the Warlock and the Ranger, both of which I ranked higher than the Sorcerer and the Wizard. And the Rogue I put under the Ranger, but our community thinks it's higher.
I'm not surprised at this. I think that the Rogue often is a fan favorite. We can just see that. And people love playing Blaster, Sorcerers, and Wizards, and they are good. Just don't sell the Ranger short. I think that there really is a lot of strength there, and that's all I would say to that. I don't think the community's wrong at all in their assessment of this. I just think that it's often hard to recognize the Ranger for the strengths that they have.
Yeah, and generally I think that this lands very safely in mostly agreement with where we landed.
Yeah.
And I think that we can clearly see which classes are excellent damage dealers, which ones are pretty awesome damage dealers, and which ones you probably shouldn't rely on for damage dealing. And I think it all checks out.
The Bard got no votes.
The Bard got no votes, so maybe my D tier was justified.
Maybe it is. Worth noting that the Monk tied the Cleric with only 16 responses and beat the Druid on that too.
Interesting, and I appreciate that. Thank you, Monk fans, for understanding that monks can be pretty okay at some things. Sadly, I can never say that the Monk's the best at anything, but they're pretty good at some stuff.
In fact, the Monk even beat the Artificer. In the community polls in terms of responses. I think the Artificer's pretty much better. But when we're looking at these low numbers, it's really hard to break out the signal to noise ratio. So take for that what you will.
So this has been a look at who the best damage dealer in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is. If you have different opinions on who you think the best damage dealer is, let us know in the comments below.
The videos that we make on our channel are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider supporting our show by clicking the links in the description below.
And if you want to watch our friend Jill just prove to you how good of a damage dealer many of these classes are, you should check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we've got plenty more tier ranking videos for you right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time
In the dungeon.